G'day folks, and welcome to this session report from a recent playthrough of Eylau 1807. This is the scenario 1, the Battle for Night Quarters, 7th of February 1807. Disclosure up front, I make a lot of rules and tactical and strategic errors, so a lot of mistakes in this game. It's a learning scenario. I was coming to grips with the rules, which is why I didn't do a live playthrough on this, but it's really fascinating. Mistakes, acknowledged. A really fascinating playthrough anyway, and I did learn a lot. So this is really a learning scenario. I am learning from the many mistakes I made. And this is an opportunity to share those mistakes. In this scenario, you ignore most of the orders, systems, and activations and so forth. You're just focusing on movement, fire, combat, the assault rules, retreat rules, and things like that. In this scenario, whoever controls the most hexes in Prototype Eylau at the end of the scenario wins. There are 13 hexes, so the Russians have really set up defending those hexes. There's Freiheit up in the northwest, to the bottom of the image. That helps them defend. But the first mistake the Russians made is in defending in this way. They probably should have had a more rounded defense, probably pull back that division in the center and not being so forward along the map edge. I was expecting the French to arrive in the northwest to the left of the image, which they initially did, but they have much more flexibility in their arrival, which we'll see in just a moment. So if you're playing this scenario, pull back your Russian defenses. The town hexes as obstructed terrain provide huge defensive benefits, so place your units in those town hexes. And I was far too bunched together. This is one of the most important things I learned from playing this scenario, is to give plenty of space between my formations. This is a view from the southeast looking northwest. So you can see sort of Markov's division in the south and Bagavu's division in and around Eylau. But even at this stage, they are too bunched up, too close together. Regiments don't have retreat paths. Spacing is critical in this game. What other considerations? Look, at this stage, I've got the cavalry out on the right, which I think was a good, a decent decision. The problem for the Russians early is they will find themselves pretty soon outnumbered by French cavalry. We'll see that in just a moment. What else do we have in this image? Well, we've got the 8th Division way out on the left, and as I said a moment ago, they should have pulled back. They have to set up west or to the left of Prototype Eylau and south of Freiheit, which they are, but they've really pushed the limits of that setup. They should have pulled back maybe 5 or 6 hexes to the south, and maybe ignored Freiheit. As I said, that obstructed terrain is really good, but we'll very quickly find out the limit of activations. You get basically up to 3 activations for every formation per turn, but that second and third restrict your movement allowances, and that becomes very limiting, so you've got to be really careful. Okay, so this is the initial setup, and then the French come on the board. And as you can see here, they come on all over north, west, and south of Freiheit, which is that town to the sort of in the center of the image here, just below Eylau. The cavalry initially arrived out on the left, I believe. This is the 1st Dragoon Division under Klein, out on the left there. They're outnumbered by the Russians, so they move forward. The Russians initially moved up in the north to surround the French infantry in the center. This is the 2nd Division 4 Corps under Laval, but the Russian cavalry moved to counter, and so Klein had to come on and protect that north. And it's fair to say I think the Russians got the upper hand here. I think they outnumbered the French and they got the better of this skirmish. Then we bring in, I think it was the Cavalry Reserve 4th Corps under St. Joseph in the south. So they arrive on the right flank of the French positions, and they very quickly outflank the Russians. And this is where, I'm learning this lesson about Russian setup disposition, but also how quickly this cavalry can move. Cavalry speed across the battlefield. Infantry move typically at 4, sometimes 5 hexes. This cavalry is moving at 7, 8, 9. And it doesn't take long for them to very quickly overwhelm these Russian positions. Another valuable lesson here is the strength of squares. Now, we should know this. I was thinking, okay, well, I'll form some squares for my sort of more advanced or isolated Russian battalions, or regiments, but I'll try and hold a line, and the lines just do not hold. The critical factor here was just retreats. There are retreats going on everywhere. Now, because there's only, in this scenario, there's only one fire combat cube, fire combat was pretty minimal. Most of the action revolved around the assault rules. So basically the cavalry and the infantry are assaulting pretty much constantly because they're always under attack orders here. Units are moving and assaulting, moving and assaulting, moving and assaulting. So it was a constant back and forth assault sequence. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, those who know Napoleonic warfare will probably be aware that much of the tactical focus, so much of fighting revolved around close to medium range exchange of fire. This is what the assault process effectively reflects. It's that close exchange of fire. It's not necessarily charging into a hex, although that is part of it. So the assault rules are quite broad in what they represent. So I can see here, St. Joseph's Cavalry Reserve 4th Corps is really advancing rapidly on the right, and the Russians just struggling. They weren't forming square, mistakes were made. You can see here the French cavalry on the left is trying to rally. In the centre, infantry pushing up into free height, but it is a slow grind through these town obstructed terrain hexes in the centre, and so Laval's division, 2nd Division 4 Corps, is kind of struggling in the centre. It's a slow grind. This is where I bring in the reinforcements. This is 3rd Division 4th Corps under Legrand on their right, and their job is to push straight to Proshech Eylau. At the same time, here is where the Russians have learnt their lesson, and you can see these squares being formed in the south half of that Russian line. They've got cavalry in the north, they've got infantry in the centre holding the last few areas of free height, and in the south they are forming square against this mass of St. Joseph's cavalry, and this does the job. The cavalry really struggled to charge these squares, and that's kind of reflecting the value of a square. But it took me a couple of turns to appreciate how substantial these squares were in terms of how they're implemented by subtle little die roll modifiers. Even infantry assaulting a square suffer penalties. They benefit most from fire combat. Infantry engaging in fire combat against a square get a decent modifier, and that's where they do a lot of damage. And so we bring in Legrand's infantry, and they set up to clear out the remnants of, I think it's the Russian 8th Division in the centre south of free height. They push them out of the way. Cavalry clears the rest of the way. The infantry really pull back. This is the Russian infantry under Markov, Division Markov in the south. They're the pink units. They eventually pull back to the south of Proshech Eylau as well. I was trying to form a line of squares just so that the cavalry couldn't really surround and pick off any of these infantry units. So I think it's fair to say, because of the mistakes I made as the Russians, the French had the upper hand, and they were punishing a lot of these Russian units and advancing quite freely until the Russians learnt these lessons, started forming square, and this is when the French are bringing on their infantry. But again, infantry is slow, and it's a slow grind, and they have to assault, and assaults often don't go well. Now, infantry aren't punished for a failed assault, it just means they're using up an activation to no effect. Now, the cavalry skirmish in the northwest continued throughout all this, constant back and forth. What did I do here? I did continue to try to push the situation with the French. I was trying to get that Russian cavalry to pull back, but every time they were pushed back, they countered. In the centre, free height was mostly cleared by the French 2nd Division, and by this stage, kind of midway through, we've got Laval's sorry, yeah, no, not Laval. It's by this stage, I think it's Legrand's 3rd Division pushing up on the right and starting to hit the hexes of Prussic Eylau. You can see the cavalry are pretty much stopped here. The cavalry actually pulled away to give room for the infantry to move up. So the cavalry swung around to the right flank, and they don't play much more of a role in the fighting. From now on, it's just this back and forth around Prussic Eylau. I realise that it's tough to push into these hexes. So this is where I bring in some more reinforcements. I think this is the 1st Division 4th Corps under Saint-Hilaire. They arrive, and they arrive late, and I'm trying to get them to push through. And this is where I face these issues of just areas being too densely occupied. I did not space out my formations. I did not give room for manoeuvre. The cavalry and the artillery and the infantry are blocking the manoeuvre of Saint-Hilaire's division. They are very frustrated. It costs extra to move up onto the escarpment. So, and they can only, first activation is full movement, 4, second activation is -1, third is -2. So they've really become restricted as they try and rush towards Prussic Eylau. French cavalry in the north, I bring on the cuirassiers to help rebalance that situation. The Russians are retreating in the north, cavalry pulling right back. French got a few lucky results and retreated the Russian cavalry. And yeah, that's about it. So this is this gradual grind through this obstructed terrain in the centre. You can see the French here are starting to capture some of the hexes of Prussic Eylau. And by about this stage, it was probably the high point. The Russians rally, they counterattack. The Russians bring their own reinforcements in, which you can see arriving just to the northeast of Prussic Eylau. In the north, the cavalry kind of goes quiet. You've only got 5 Russian activations, 6 French activations, and both sides are focusing their activations on that action around Prussic Eylau. At this stage, the French had been pushed out from the southern side of Prussic Eylau. Russians had retaken the ground. Their units are very weak in strength at this stage. Their infantry in those town hexes are down to, in some cases, 1, 2, or 3 strength points, which is really limiting their ability to engage in both fire combat and successful assaults. But all they need is a couple of lucky die rolls. There's so many of them, I guess. And they managed to just push the French out enough. The biggest French concern here is they just do not have the movement points to get back in there. Saint-Hilaire's division is trying to get close, but yeah, they've literally got some hills to climb. And it's you can see the traffic jam leading up to Prussic Eylau. They do not have the space to manoeuvre. And so this is actually the situation at the end of the scenario. The scenario ended with the Russians controlling, I think it was most 1, 2, 3, 4, I think they controlled 9 out of 13 of the hexes of Prussic Eylau. And despite being absolutely battered and smashed, the Russians win this scenario. Many valuable lessons learned. And let me talk about kind of the lessons that I've learned here. So firstly, spacing. You really, really have got to space out your battalions and regiments. You do not want to condense them too closely together. You need to facilitate retreat paths. You do not want your different divisions to be too close together. You've got to give each division room for their battalions and regiments to manoeuvre and for divisions to be able to move through. It's slow to wheel around and manoeuvre. And so you must have that space. That's the first lesson. So far more spacing in the next scenario. Secondly, infantry must form square when they see cavalry approaching. They just get absolutely smashed if they're in line formation. I didn't really use column formation to assault. There are benefits for using column formation to assault, but I didn't really... Units in line are far more effective at fire combat. In this scenario, fire combat was minimal, and maybe I could have benefited from having some of these units in line to charge, because given how a typical division will charge, has a capacity to charge, I think 3 times, at most 3 times during a turn, whereas at most they'll engage in 2 fire combats. And if they're trying to gain ground, as they were here, then the assaults are more valuable. So if I were to replay this, I'd probably put a lot more units in column, assault in column, rather than trying to assault in line. Yes, they hit a lot of these Russian units. Yes, they cause a lot of casualties among these Russian units, but ultimately they failed to capture enough of the hexes in Eylau by being in line. What else? Artillery was useless, and that's my own fault. You really need to think carefully about where you place your artillery. Artillery placement is very important. They are kind of the glass cannon. They can do devastating impact at close range, but they are so easily destroyed by cavalry charges, infantry charges, and so forth. So you've got to very carefully maneuver and place your cavalry and place your artillery, in good positions with good lines of sight. And too often I found my artillery out of position, in an awkward placement. You can see the Russian artillery getting sort of swamped. They're in the northern, 4 batteries, and the northern tip of Eylau facing north, whilst the French are hitting Eylau from the south. So, yeah, think carefully about where you place your artillery. There are some important lessons to be learned here. Cavalry is interesting. They are at their best when they are forcing infantry to retreat. They basically, you want to maximize the potential for combined arms. So bring your cavalry in, force enemy infantry into square, and then wheel your cavalry around. Don't charge those squares. Bring your infantry in to fire on those squares, or assault those squares. Now, I'm surprised that the modifiers for infantry in line or in column assaulting squares is punitive. Defensive infantry benefit from being in square against an infantry assault. Not a huge fan of that, but that's probably a little bugbear. But yes, cavalry is good for forcing infantry into square. When infantry hit square, they struggle. So they've really got to maneuver, and support the infantry, and enable space for the infantry to make their own way up. What else? Look, as I said, we're not using formation rules or orders here. Spacing is important, so getting your divisional commanders in a position to activate all the units of their formation is critical. A couple of times I found my units out of range, so you've got to really think carefully about that. All right, that's about it, folks. Thank you for watching. Russian victory. Take care.